Hey everyone, Joe Glines here in Dallas. My friend
Yeah,
Jackie.
and Jack is Duke in Denmark.
We're up for another quick chat. I hope everyone had a good holiday break. Um, I know we did.
Yeah, for sure.
Did you get enough snow there, Jackie? Was it cold enough?
We didn't actually get too much snow, but yeah, it was cold enough. That's for sure.
Yeah, we this is like our fourth year in a row with zero snow. We used to get a little here and there, but I don't mind it. But I know the kids like it.
Yeah. We also used to get a little bit more snow than we do right now. Yeah.
So today we were going to talk about kind of the differences between an API call and a web browser, using a web browser. And of course, this is where, we actually, so if you haven't seen them, we have webinars on both, on API calls and web services, and we have a webinar on web scraping. And of course, a browser going to a page is technically an API call, right? That's the first thing to realize. The other thing, which also, this is the part that I think confuses a lot of people, is an API, like Windows has an API available to it as well, right? And that you can programmatically connect to Windows and who knows what else, right? That those are application programming interfaces, right?
Yeah.
That you can connect to programmatically and do stuff with. Most nowadays, when people mention, oh, there's an API call for that, I think on average, people are actually meaning a web service API, which is a service like Google Maps or something, where you can programmatically do a query to their server and return certain data. And it's the great thing is, of course, is it's usually nowadays it's more JSON than XML, but it's one of the two typically. I'd say like 99% of the time, it's one of those two data getting returning back. The file size is incredibly smaller, right? I think we looked at it; it was like 120K or 200K compared to like a meg for a web page.
Mm-hmm. And if you get used to looking at those API returned JSON or XML, and if you have ever, and you may have done that at some point, played with HTML, you may notice that both of them are just structured data.
Mm-hmm.
So when you say that getting a web page or browsing the internet is just API calls, that's totally the case, because it's just more advanced, but it's still just structured plain text that you're mostly getting back.
Yeah, and actually, so to follow up on that, because you're spot on, right? A web browser most of the time is returning HTML instead of XML or JSON. And that's structuring it in a way that the browser is going to render it in a certain way, depending on the device you're looking at and what country you're in and language and settings you got, right? It does all this adjustments for it. Whereas most, actually, correct me if I'm wrong, Jackie, I mean, most APIs, they don't do any of that. But maybe they can adjust for the country you're in and language. I don't think I've ever used one that does that. But I think for the most part, the data is the data, right? It's agnostic to where you are.
Yeah, one of the things with web pages generally is that stuff like the headers, the cookies, and all of that stuff behind the scenes are telling the server just quite a good amount of stuff about you.
Yep.
Where with the API, most of the time you might give it some credentials to kind of say, I have access, please give me data, but it will give you very, very pure refined data instead of stuff that's meant to be visualized in different aspects and ways. So yeah, most of the time the APIs will just give you the same thing no matter who you really are.
The other big difference, I don't know how I want to say difference, but web browsers, typically when the HTML comes back, it's like a framework where within that, the things that come back might even have API calls as well to pull in more data to keep filling the web page, right? Especially like you scroll down or you filter something or you check a box, and that'll trigger, I think, I don't know if it's still, is it Ajax more often than not, or is there a different one that gets used now for after your page is loaded? You don't navigate to a new page. It's not a server call for the new page, but on that page, it'll actually update that page.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what it is today that's doing most of the stuff, but yeah, it could be JavaScript, it could be whichever thing was behind the scenes, like PHP or stuff like that. That's doing.
Now, see, this is where I don't know this stuff. Are both of both of those cases though? At least with JavaScript, I kind of think JavaScript might trigger it, but is it actually doing the call? I didn't realize it would do stuff like that. Is it, or would it rely on Ajax or something else to actually do the API call?
No, JavaScript could do it.
Okay.
And has the access to whatever the browser can do. So just as you can navigate from one page to another or grab data from one page or do stuff like that, JavaScript can do it to some degree at least. It might be able to do way more than I know, but you have at least some restrictions because cross-domain communication and stuff like that to kind of keep people safe will limit what it can do. But let's say you have a web server and you actually ask the JavaScript to send in a request, that might call a function on the server that has PHP, Ajax, whatever, to do the task that you're asking, to go out and get some kind of stuff from either a server database or from another API somewhere and return that to the JavaScript function that can then be displayed on the screen. So yeah, it can be very involved, but yeah, there's probably a lot more ways to actually do it than what I.
So by the way, it was a fun little thing I was doing the other. Actually, before I go there, or I mentioned to you earlier, I spoke with Gio this morning, and the guy that did our neural networks webinar, and during during the interview with him, he mentioned, he's like, yeah, normally now I do more programming than automation. And I'm like, hey, let's talk about that right now. Like, what is the difference between automation and programming? And it was an interesting conversation because we were like, automation, we kind of teased out of it was like more when there's usually, there's a GUI usually involved, right? And a human doing stuff. And when you automate it, you're actually sending stuff to the GUI, in place of the human, right? You're removing the human aspect, but you're automating the still same controls and things that the program has, versus when you actually are writing a program, it's really more of API type stuff, and you're connecting directly with the program, and you've completely bypassed a GUI entirely or any human interaction.
Yeah. I'd also say with the topic that we talked about today with API calls and web scraping is that because programming might be one way to put it, is way more abstract. You need to kind of grasp either the API or documentation for that API to get the stuff you need returned. Whereas web scraping or automation is way more, it's easy to test, it's easier to quality make sure, because you can actually visually go in and check that the value you got was the correct one. Whereas if it's some kind of complex API, that might be quite hard. If, let's say, you're returning number plates for cars in a specific state, if you have that on a web page and you get a list and you scrape that and put it, you can actually go and check. Whereas if you get something returned from an API and you get 45 and you were expecting 50, it can be quite hard to actually know if it's just because, hey, there ain't any more than 45, or was there a mistake? Where with automation, you are acting like a user. You can much more easily see if what you are doing still resembles and the stuff that you want to happen is happening visually in one way or another. Where when you're programming, you kind of give that up to get more speed, more consistency and stuff like that. But it becomes more of a mental task or whatever you'd call
abstract kind of,
yeah.
Which actually, because earlier, before we started this call, I was showing Jackie some stuff I was playing with earlier, and I had mentioned that I was using the WinHTTP request to do some stuff, and then I had tried the other XML, something I forget what it is, but it leverages the browser's cookies, and we had said how we used to do that before, and part of that is because sometimes logging in, to doing things can be complex. Right. And it's one of those things that also I think it parallels with the whole API call versus a browser. Like the browser takes care of a lot of other background stuff that, like, as a programmer, you need to be able to do, which is why I love APIs. But when they have that OAuth 2 that you got to program to get do the handshake and get your token value and stuff, like, it depends. Some of them I've done in 5 minutes or less. Right. But some of them I've spent 5 days and, like, felt like I didn't move. But anyway, I think it's interesting how we happen to be talking about that, but it is similar that, like, APIs have a steeper learning curve than browser stuff. But at the same time, they are, once you get the hang of them, they're amazing, right? They're so exciting because, to your point, the speed mainly and consistency, right? They don't really change. The data is the data, and they keep going, and they're awesome.
Yeah, and logins generally on websites have also gone up in difficulty behind the scenes. A user doesn't actually see it. He just types in his username and his password, and he clicks submit or OK or log in.
Or he uses, like, Facebook, right? He doesn't even do that. He just logs in social.
It just happens. It's easy. He doesn't really see anything. When new people come to AutoHotkey and try to do automation or logging in or stuff like that, and they can follow some tutorials that will actually let them fill in values and fields on websites. And when they do that, they see the value there in the field, and they can see that the script is actually clicking the button, but it says that they did something wrong. Either they didn't enter a username or whatever, but they can see the value in the field. But because the API or the code or whatever you'd call it that lies behind, the need there is more. It either needs events to happen or it needs hidden fields to be filled that happens when a user enters stuff, where when you do it programmatically. All of that stuff is just that extra layer that has come, and most of it is probably for security, but not all of it. Some of it is just because that person who made it had maybe a better abstract idea of what he wanted to have happen, and he programmed that, and the user sees it as easy, but to actually automate it, you need to cater to what the programmer he wanted.
Right. Yeah, I was even going to say they might have used it elsewhere where security or something really mattered, and then they're like, well, I have this thing I've used before, I'll just use it again. Right. Who knows why they pick some of the stuff they do. But yeah, it is funny because you're right. In nowadays, a lot of the web pages, even though you see the value there, and I get actually people a lot saying, like, I put it there, but it's saying that, it doesn't accept it. I'm like, well, it's typically an event listener, right, that you need to trigger in some way. But it has become closer, leaning on the API side of the programming side. You got to understand a little bit more than what you used to, unless you do it old school, which is sometimes I've just said, you know what, screw it, I'm going to use my find text function to find where that is on the page and literally click there and then have AutoHotkey send the keystrokes, because then I really am mimicking exactly what I do in the browser, and it negates the whole thing, because as far as the browser knows, that's what someone did.
Yeah, and that's a hard part as well, because we have both built on our knowledge with AutoHotkey over the years, and at one point you're at least in a new place than the new people coming in, and when they ask you, you want to give them the best method that you have found. But the learning curve to get there is maybe so high that you really need to ask yourself quite often, I'd say, what is this user's actual need? Do they just need to find the button to click? Can you give them something that will do that for them? Or is the need for them to actually have something that works reliably while they use the mouse for something else or whatever it might be? And that's one of the interesting parts of AutoHotkey, I feel, is that people are allowed to come in and always, maybe not always, but at least we expect most of users to come in at a newbie level.
Yeah.
So we might not have that many top programmers, whatever you'd call that, but we have quite a good medium amount of people that are able to help from the bottom up, maybe not with all of the highest top types of programming that needs to be done. We have a few that can do that, but most of the people that stay within the community are people that can help newbies and still understand where they're coming from and not really tell them, you need to go there and learn that entire library over there and then come back and I can.
But you know why, Jackie? And I can tell you this because I've done so many of these one-on-one interviews with people, and we've already known this, right? Is the vast majority of people, and even no matter what level they've gotten to, they just didn't start off as programmers, right? They started AutoHotkey and they learned it, and they I can't think of his name that does the AutoHotkey H, right? That guy, he did such advanced stuff, and yet he's not a programmer, right? So we all started off knowing we know nothing and stepping into it. Remember how painful and tough it was. So I think that's one of the things that we're different about as compared to other forums, right? Is we're more patient. We've been there, and it's to your point. It's easier when you've been there, and to help people like, okay, we'll get you what you need, and it's okay. Right.
Yeah, and I'd say, I don't know with other communities, but at least with the AutoHotkey community, calm, because we're so closely tied to Windows and that stuff, and the automating of IE, you can find so many examples throughout the history of, at least since calm was a thing within AutoHotkey, and people will keep pointing at that if you want to do something with a web page, where if you went to Python or whatever, you would probably be pointed to some kind of library that'll let you make those HTTP calls instead, because hey, that's the programmable way of doing it. Where most of us are not at that level, and we will still be at that kind of automating like a user, maybe at a more advanced level, but still mostly as a user.
Yeah. So, which actually brings up another point, at least topically, of what we're talking about, is the cool thing about AutoHotkey, of course, is I can be doing something with my browser and then connect to that and either change it or extract data from it, right? And like in other languages, I'm not so sure you can do that from that page. You might be able to navigate, go grab the URL somehow, and then in the back end go and navigate to it. But who knows if actually all the stuff comes up what you've already clicked and checked, right? That it probably wouldn't be the same. And then the example I was showing you earlier, we talked about it because you were looking at it, and right now, I was planning to actually do both. I'm using the browser to get past the first couple of steps of it because they were kind of painful to program. And I'm like, you know what? If I just use a browser and come here, that's fine. I'll fill out, because I automated filling out that form I showed you, and then hit submit. And then the next page, I'd come up with like 50 links or so. Each one of those links, you had to have the right cookie to it was the same cookie, don't get me wrong, but it had to have been from the previous page. So when you navigate to it, it has to have the cookie as well, otherwise it doesn't load properly. But my plan was to use the WinHTTP request to go pull that data instead of using IE to navigate to it. And just because IE, just as time goes on, it's getting slower and slower and just, more issues with it. And I thought, hey, if I can grab all these links with the browser, I can quickly go get the data and then I'll still load it into a DOM object and parse it and get what I want. But it should be incredibly faster than with IE opening each page and then waiting for it to load and then grabbing what I want. But now I might go ahead and automate it, programmatically do the entire thing. We'll see, but yeah.
Yeah, and I also get that, and I'm not sure, maybe some years ago, APIs had more limits on them, where web pages and stuff like that could be the quick way of doing it, because most companies were very focused on making sure that web page users were getting the quickest response, the most from the server, and those not so important people who were grabbing a few bits and pieces from whatever API they had. We'll get to them, or they may only get 100 values an hour or whatever limit there were on there. Right. Where if you went to the web page, you could grab, let's say, 6,000 pages within a few minutes. Yeah. And that was a very, very quick way of doing it. Today, I'm not sure that that's really the case anymore. I know that at least last year was very focused on APIs, and maybe also the year before then. So, yeah.
Yeah, actually, let me see if I can pull this up. Programmatical web. There we go. Because remember when we did our webinar on them, they had someone here that they had the over time how many there were each one, and I haven't looked at it in at least a year, maybe even more. I'm curious if how many now they list. Compare over this last year, like if it's still been growing exponentially, because it was growing like crazy the last couple years.
Yeah. But I know that it's some years ago when I was making a Google Translate script, and if I used the API, I could do 100 transcripts or something a day, or translations a day. Whereas if I actually use the browser, not a logged in one, and it might have switched APIs or IPs and stuff like that. I don't know, but at least I wasn't actually limited, because I was just using the web page and could do as many translations as I actually wanted, or so it seemed. Whereas with the API, I had limits, or I needed to pay to extend those limits. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember you had to. It was kind of ironic, right? Because you'd have to make it look like you were using a web browser to get more. It was very weird. Here's the page. I guess it still hasn't been updated recently, but this was, so that's 2016. So I assume this was 2017 was the last year. But I'll bet you it's still been climbing like crazy, because
most likely, yeah.
Yeah. But they have over 17,000 documented APIs to just as a link to go, you can search for stuff and see what's out there. But that was the slow, steady growth, and then it just started really took off. And I wouldn't be surprised if this increase got even steeper.
Yeah, it could. Most likely that's at least what the tech world is saying themselves, that everything is just still climbing in speed. But let's see how long it actually goes, because one of the things I heard recently was that we're kind of getting to some of the limits on some of the stuff. So we'll probably see some kind of, maybe not slow down, but maybe not, it might not actually pick up speed anymore or soon.
But speaking of which, I forgot to mention this earlier. You were talking about the security and stuff and logging in and things. And I think I sent you the article a couple weeks ago I saw, but it basically estimated, over half of all internet traffic is bots, right? It's not even humans doing stuff. And so that, of course, is one of the reasons why for the website logins that they do have tried to make them more difficult to try to stop. A lot of people don't want, the bots going to their site.
No.
But I mean, and then of course you build APIs specifically so people will programmatically go and pull your data. But yeah.
Yeah. I had a job. It must be at least 2 years ago or something, where it was a job to actually scrape web data. And while I was doing it, I uncovered that the web pages were actually getting the data that they were showing from an internal API that was publicly available, not documented, but it was available. So when I did stuff on the web page, I could see the actual calls that were being made and could mimic them and get the data that way, which sped up all of it.
Oh yeah, I did one recently, the same thing, where I realized the web browser, I'm like, oh, it's doing API calls to pull this stuff in, and I mimicked it and allowed me to, I never had to use the browser anymore. I just, it was actually, I think I would have to once to get that original like cookie token, and then I could crank through stuff like no tomorrow. And it was, I can't even, I should do the math, but it went from taking days to run to like maybe an hour and a half or something. I mean, it was so fast. And it was looking at using either Fiddler or some of the developer tools in the browser to see when this browser loads a page, what requests are happening, and just kind of looking at it and going, hey, can I fake this? And, sure enough, in that case I could. But yeah, often, like you said, sometimes you don't even need to fake it, right? They just, like, I think Yahoo Finance is that way too. You'll go somewhere and you can see Yahoo Finance is actually calling their own APIs to pull in different fields. And like, you don't actually have to have the browser. You can go do that yourself and have the data however you want it.
Yeah. Makes good sense.
Yeah. Is there anything else we should bring up in this?
I just say that one of the big differences I see between web scraping and API calls is API calls, I either need to backwards engineer whatever is happening or have a good documentation of it to be able to use it. Whereas with web scraping, it kind of is self-explanatory, because what you see is what you can get most of the time. So, yeah.
I'd explain it a little differently, because but I'm not disagreeing with you. But the first one, you're actually like, I was doing one with real estate the other day, and I'm looking at the documentation, and I'm like, I wrote them, and I said, hey, I can't get this thing to work. And then the guy actually, he wanted to call me, and he's like, hey, he did call me, and he goes, yeah, I'm just trying. I thought he was trying to sell me stuff right at first. I'm like, yeah, whatever. He's like, no, I was just trying to give you access for a couple of weeks to see if you like it, for free. And I'm like, oh, okay. And I'm like, well, I'm trying to get this work. He's like, he's like, I don't even know. And he's like their lead developer. He's like, I don't even know that dummy. They had like a demo site that they would give you access to. And he's like, I've never looked at it. Someone set it up. He's like, I don't use it. So he's like, here's your endpoints, and here are a couple examples. He gave me some Postman scripts that I could look at how they did stuff. But all of the documentation was all totally wrong, right? Because it wasn't like for the endpoint, they didn't have anything. So it is those little things like, hey, having documentation is obviously for an API, because you can't. There is like a Wordle or something. There's something that you can send a query to the server, and sometimes it will tell you. It will basically export some of the documentation for you on some of them.
Okay.
But it's not that common anymore. I think it used to be pretty common. But where I was going with that with the web page, I think you said something like, it's not self-evident, but you said like it's it's there. And
self-explanatory, I said.
Yeah. Okay. And I would just change that a little, say it's not, because if it's self-explanatory, I can bring my son in here and he can look at it and like figure it out, right? But you're right in the sense that it's all the information should be there, right? And you can pull it out of it. But you have to understand, the DOM and HTML and other stuff, right? But you're right. All the information it should be there, or like even those stupid event listeners, right? That took me a while to still, like, I might run into some issues there, but for the most part, you're right. You can detect what the network traffic's going on, and the stuff is there. Unlike an API call, you can't just guess. You can't just do something and figure it out. Yeah.
And that's kind of what I mean. If you have, let's say, 10,000 values and a page on the web page can hold 100 of them, and then you need to click next, and then it will load 100 more.
Yeah.
Where with the API call, you need to know exactly which point you need to call and how much it will return. Either it will return them all, or it might still return them in chunks.
Yeah, the pagination.
You need to call that the correct way and with the right parameters. Whereas if you go to the web page, you can see the 100 values, you can grab them, and you can ask it to click the button and then grab the next ones. That's what I meant by it being self-explanatory. It's what you see is what you get. So it's right there. It's accessible in a very much simpler way. Not what the code you need to write to grab it, but how you actually see the data. Does that make more sense? Yeah. Whereas with the API, it's hidden somewhere in a database somewhere.
Oh, absolutely.
And,
the thing I'd add on to that, because I just did this recently, and I was very lucky. I was doing almost exactly what you described. It wasn't LinkedIn. Let's just use LinkedIn as an example. I would go to a page and I could grab the profiles of people, and then I'd hit the next button, and in the next LinkedIn's 20. Again, it actually wasn't LinkedIn, and you could go to a certain, I think it was 200, and then the web browser stopped, right? But I was looking at the parameters in the URL, and I saw it like get to 200, and I'm like, well, there is no next on the browser page, but I'm going to just automate and filling that URL and go to 201, and sure enough, page 201 loaded with new people on it. Right. So I was able to go up, if I remember, I could go up to 1,000 just because I tested this and I tried going over 1,000 and it crashed then, but it allowed me to get so many more. And of course, if you're using a browser, you could never have done that. But I was just like, well, I'll try it. And thankfully it worked. It saved me a lot of work, but it was one of those, don't forget to experiment, because just because the web page is set up a certain way, it doesn't mean that the servers actually are limited by that.
No, that's correct. Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. Well, this has been fun. You think we're good? I think we're...
Yeah, I believe we talked about the two things and we got...
And we actually stayed on topic. This is amazing.
Yeah. Good job. Yeah.
All right, man. I'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.